Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on Precision at Scale, Enabling Novel Therapeutics with Nanoparticle Manufacturing. I'm Diana, and I'd love to tell you all about manufacturing today. Fortis Life Sciences partners with diagnostics and life science companies to design, validate, and manufacture solutions to solve their complex development problems. Our tailored approach and end-to-end capabilities accelerate the work for our customers as they bring the next generation of medicines and diagnostics to market. We serve a global customer base that has offices across North America, including 4 R&D sites and 3 GMP and ISO 13485 compliant manufacturing facilities. The site I'm talking about today is Nanocomposites, which is based in San Diego, California. As Tim mentioned, I support project management and technical sales at Nanocomposites, which is the Nanomaterials and Chemistry Center of Excellence of Fortis Life Sciences. Today, I'm going to go through important considerations when undertaking development and scale-up of nanomaterials. We have been making nanomaterials here on site for almost 20 years and have a lot of experience in the synthesis, characterization, and functional testing of various nanomaterials. The founding principle of the company was to create a source of particles where you can trust the properties you are requesting are aligned with what you actually receive, hence the emphasis on characterization of everything we make. Nanocomposites has GMP capabilities and is ISO 13485 certified for device. We are also licensed with the state of California for drug manufacture. We specialize in precisely engineered nanomaterials with finely controlled surface chemistries, including conjugation to various proteins and other ligands. We've made nanomaterials for applications across the diagnostic, therapeutic, and industrial fields, but today I'm going to be mainly discussing the use of nanomaterials in therapeutic applications and what it takes to go from R&D to a commercial product in this space. Nanomaterials have been up and coming in drug delivery for over 40 years, but their utilization in approved therapeutics has been fairly slow, starting with polymeric particles and the pagylation techniques of the early 90s to Doxil and different emulsions being approved, all the way to today's recent approval of lipid nanoparticles used for COVID vaccines. Successful implementation of drugs involving nanoparticles are few and far between still, but when they succeed, they elevate the standard of care in that industry. As it's well known in the CMC space, the biggest challenge to approval of these novel nanomaterials isn't just seeing efficacy. The biggest hurdle is actually being able to make these materials reproducibly with high precision and preserving the same properties from making them at small scales to making them at large scales. A lot of very promising technologies fail, not because they don't work or have efficacy, but because they are difficult to reproduce and manufacture. We specialize in technical transfers of nanomaterials across the range of different materials you see here, but our specific areas of expertise are in mesoporous silica, polymeric particles, gold particles, and magnetic nanomaterials. So I'm assuming most of you are probably fairly familiar with the benefits of nanomaterials for drug delivery, but I wanted to break down the classes of particles we make into 2 groups. One is where the nanomaterials are the delivery vehicle for an API, and the other is where the nanomaterials are the active component of the therapeutic. In the first, more common category, nanomaterials are used as a vehicle to improve the efficacy of an API in some way. This could be through extending its circulation half-life, adding a targeting functionality, improving the safety of the formulation, or allowing for co-delivery with other APIs that have synergistic effects with it. Different materials, loading strategies, and functionalization chemistry all play a part in ensuring a targeted formulation that has better efficacy than the drug alone. An example of this is how COVID vaccines use lipid nanoparticles to deliver mRNA. In the second type, Specific properties of nanomaterials allow them to perform some benefit over the bulk type of that material that is useful in a therapeutic application. So interactions between these particles and a stimulus, for example, an ultrasonic pulse or a laser, can create a therapeutic effect that is the active pharmaceutical ingredient. This mechanism may also involve targeting capabilities, or the particle itself may behave as a decoy for something else in a disease system. An example of this is targeted gold nanoparticles for photothermal therapy of cancer, where the laser is used to ablate tumors by targeting the gold nanoparticles and heating them up with a laser signal. So the first topic we want to bring up when discussing nanomaterial manufacturing for therapeutic applications is quality. A lot of times when novel nanomaterials are being developed, the focus first goes to improving the efficacy or creating a better formulation, and oftentimes quality gets shelved for later. What we've learned is that we have to go hand in hand with phase-appropriate steps, but the earlier we bring the quality component in, the less time that gets wasted going down a path that needs to be backtracked. Our Director of Quality and Regulatory Affairs and the rest of our QA team are extremely experienced at working with our customers early. They'll discuss with our customers' regulatory team from the very first steps of projects. We take a carefully integrated approach between our internal and your internal quality teams to execute plans from the first stages of starting a project. Something to note here is we are never the drug sponsor. Our job as a CDMO is to work closely with you, be the manufacturer of record, and listen to your QA's needs for level of controls, etc., to make appropriate decisions specific to your program. We make sure we do our best to set you up for success and follow the decisions you're making and implementing the quality plan. One thing a lot of people leave till later, but can really impact things all the way back in R&D, is considering what regulatory classification your nanoparticle product will have. For example, sometimes the nanoparticles we develop are a component. Sometimes for therapeutics, they may be a drug, they may be a device, or they may be a combo drug device. They may be an excipient. It's going to be a very different approach for this development path, and knowing this early on and kind of aiming towards something is critical to make sure we're making the right decisions from the start. We also want to stress here the importance of early engagement and thinking ahead to conversations with the regulatory bodies, hiring consultants where needed, etc., to set yourself up on the path for success. So once we work with customers to outline both the short and long-term plans, the first step towards a successful manufacture of your particles is paying close attention during the technical transfer phase. Technical transfers are when we take a process for making materials that have been designed externally and make sure that we can reproduce that process in-house and make the same materials. Sometimes there are very mature manufacturing processes for these nanoparticles, and it's just a matter of transitioning that to our internal equipment and our operators, but oftentimes it's kind of in an intermediate stage of development where we're going to be highlighting things that we want to do optimization on. Sometimes it's a very early protocol that has only been done reproducibly in an R&D or academic setting and hasn't been scaled up past a few milliliter. We see everything in between, and we are happy to take projects at any of these stages. The most important consideration for each of these tech transfers is to not underestimate the importance of paying attention during this phase. Time-wise, difficulty-wise, or success-wise, if we underestimate the transfer, we will miss important things to work on later. So selection of the right partner to do a tech transfer is paramount to getting a good manufacturing process at the end. It can be easy to overlook nuances in protocols that are critical for nanomaterial transfers because nanomaterials tend to be a lot more nuanced than other materials to produce. They don't always scale linearly, and even tiny changes can make dramatic differences in their performance. It's important to make sure we understand how far along the customer is in the development path of this particle, understand what steps historically have been taken, and understand what steps of the process have the most risk, and what the critical properties of the final material are, so we can begin setting specs together. It's also important to understand how many times this particle has been successfully reproduced at the current scale. Nanocomposites has a pretty good track record of utilizing our nanomaterial experience to succeed in these technical transfers. We have a very high success rate, and we take a lot of extra care in transferring these nanomaterial formulations. It involves a lot of close attention to detail, both in protocol and characterization, very close communication with the team currently fabricating the material, and if we have access to the original inventor of the technology, we make sure to leave no question unasked, as long as we have the ability to work with them to understand the nuances of this nanomaterial synthesis. Overall, the years of experience with troubleshooting common problems with nanomaterial synthesis helps us avoid pitfalls that come up during a lot of these technical transfers to CDMOs. So during this process, we are also keeping in mind next steps, reviewing the relevant procedures and identifying key risk areas, as well as parts of the process that will need future attention or optimization. Making nanomaterials is pretty straightforward if you have unlimited tries or attempts at making a material, but knowing how to make nanomaterials with the specific properties you are looking for reproducibly without scrapping batches is challenging and takes a lot of experience. So to the details, we've had processes where even switching brands of a simple reagent or changing slightly the manufacturing equipment or other small changes that you might not think would affect the outcome can dramatically change the properties of the particles that you end up with. Even a change in humidity or altitude from the original lab where the particles had been developed can make a difference. And we've even seen times where you switch from a lower grade of the material that was being used for R&D to a more pure starting material that's more suitable for future manufacturing, and that can have really unexpected impacts on particle properties. That's why control is so important even from the early stages, and why we really focus on quality first. So that leads us to the discussion of scale up and getting into true process development. So what is process development? This phase starts when R&D officially ends and you aren't making any dramatic changes, and we have a working version of the particle that performs the right function. Process development is looking carefully at all the parameters and making practical decisions about how to turn an R&D process into a manufacturing process that it can be done reproducibly, under controls, likely in a clean room environment, on appropriate equipment, and in a cost-effective and realistic way. We have a lot of scientists and engineers at Nanocomposites who are very experienced in bringing these different particle types through process development. Many of our scientists are focused on one or two specific materials, so they really know how to develop these particles. There are a lot of considerations they're making when we go through and finish the transfer. And so after R&D, our tech transfer, generally something works and the customers like this version of the particle that's being made at the small scale. They may not know what the bounds of what works for the particle, only that they like the current product and it has efficacy. For example, they might like a 50 nanometer gold sphere, but they don't know yet if a 40 nanometer gold sphere or a 60 nanometer gold sphere would work just as well for the application. Sometimes sticking to what works won't matter, but oftentimes one route is cheaper, or it's already optimized further if it's something very similar. So In the gold sphere example, the 40 nanometer sphere might already be scaled up to bulk quantities for a diagnostics project, for example, since 40 nanometers is commonly used in lateral flow. And so if our therapeutic customer switches from a 50 nanometer gold sphere to a 40 nanometer gold sphere, we've already made these particles at much larger scales, and that can save a lot of development time and money overall for the project. So at this stage, it's important to keep a phase-based approach in mind. We will do what's a good fit for your project at this time. Sometimes that means developing a really full process development program. Sometimes it means lightly de-risking each step as appropriate right now. So the level of controls for some early preclinical studies are going to be very different from maybe the final material batch for a tox study or even phase 1 studies. So it's understanding exactly what we're making the material for and making it with those specifications in mind and understanding what controls it needs to be made under. So part of what comes with experience is knowing how deep to go in to each step without putting in too many resources prior to de-risking that portion of the project. Everything is a trade-off of speed, price, and robustness of the process. So we definitely help the teams make calls on what to prioritize at this stage. The consideration that is never a trade-off is quality, which is why we started with quality. QA leads from both teams are very involved, even in early process development, making sure that we are staying phase appropriate for this stage. And if calls are made to speed up and skip different optimization steps or take different risks, we'll have open conversations about what those risks mean for your process later on and what the consequences of skipping each stage may be later and whether or not it's appropriate for the stage. So the theme here is very open communication and keeping both teams engaged and on the same page about the particles we are making. So really important to good process development are critical quality attributes. So these are, as they sound, attributes like shape, size, uniformity, absorbance peak, charge, etc., that are actually critical to your nanoparticle's function. Sometimes there's a temptation to say that every parameter about a particle is critical, but that means we could later be forced to fail batches due to a parameter that's not actually as critical to the particle's function as we thought. So when this stage of setting CQAs is rushed, or if they get chosen to arbitrarily without proper experiments and testing, we can end up walking kind of a fine tightrope during manufacture where we have to stay between certain specification targets for the product specs, and that can have expensive and long-standing consequences that weren't necessary if we'd been able to do a little extra process development and see exactly what the real critical quality attributes are. So spending some time here to do development up front can save a lot of money later down the road and getting to a more streamlined manufacturing process for that nanomaterial. Willingness to engage in investigations about the different material parameters can allow us to be more productive and reduce the manufacturing scrap rate later to get a better final price per gram of product. So understanding the critical quality attributes, what would keep the particles functioning, is essential and allows for more freedom when we go to manufacture. Also important are the critical process parameters, which are linked to your critical quality attributes. This is where we play around with and determine the parameters that are most important to getting those particle properties and how to control these parameters as we build the process. So we investigate which of the parameters are linked to which CQAs. For example, stirring rate and temperature might both be important to final size, or we might find that only stirring rate is critical and temperature is not, which can save the cost of a heated or chilled synthesis, for example. Also, an important consideration at this stage is characterization and the separation of characterization from actual analytical development. So early in process development, we want as much information about your particles as possible. So part of what helps us do a lot of characterization in-house is we have a lot of our own equipment for characterizing nanoparticles. We have electron microscopes on site, both an SEM and a TEM. We have a lot of different DLS machines. We have plate readers. We have an ICP-MS. This lets us do in-process characterization pretty early in the process and lets us understand what's going on as we make small changes and optimize. You really do want to learn as much about your particles early on and how they function, what the mechanism is, what changes when you change each manufacturing step. This is how we figure out what the specs of the particle are actually critical to function. There can be a transition between when we're getting as much characterization info about the particles as possible to when we have a more solidified process and we want to determine what the actual CQAs we should measure as part of analytical development are. Defining what you want to characterize early on versus what's actually important to measure later can save you developing more GMP analytical assays than you actually need. So at this stage, we'll get as much data on how the particles look as possible, but then determine what's actually important to measure for later on. So part of the advantage we have in knowing how to do process development on and scale up these nanomaterials is because we've been working with them for so long. CDMOs who have a broad focus on various materials rather than just nanoparticles often don't have the same foundation in how these particles have kind of interesting properties, what unit ops might be needed that wouldn't be used for a different product, and what controls to select for these types of materials. Even material compatibility is pretty important here. A good example is compatibility with plastic tubing and vials. We know exactly which brands and types are best with specific nanoparticle surfaces. For example, we found that a certain type of black nitrile seals that are often used in caps and gaskets can cause particles to aggregate when it makes contact with certain nanoparticle surface types. So we have brands of tubing that we prefer over others. We have brands of vials we prefer over others because of how they interact with certain materials and particle types. There are pitfalls in all projects, but we don't make the same mistakes twice, and we have had 20 years of mistakes to learn from and never repeat on your project. So what comes with experience is knowing exactly what is suitable for these specific materials. So at this stage, we are usually doing process development hand in hand with scale up. It's important to do them in parallel. Scaling might force you into certain unit ops that only allow certain particle traits. Sometimes we see people come in with a process that they just doesn't scale to their final target scales. So it's important to switch over this process early rather than spending time optimizing on that equipment in order to get it to a piece of equipment that will scale and they'll be able to get to their target volume. It's way better to do this and will save time on the project early on. So we will encourage, if we know your target scales are large, switching to something that's suitable to large-scale manufacture. Because if you make particles one way and you run those animal studies, spend a lot of time and money that goes into running the animal studies and find we have to switch particle types or switch particle manufacturing methods, sometimes the change is too large and we need to go back and redo those studies. So we always encourage holding off on a lot of studies until we switch to a process that can scale well. So unit op consideration, or the equipment we're using to manufacture, is part of what's critical to consider for this. It requires understanding your target scales pretty early on. So sometimes people wonder why we need to know what the clinical plan is if we're just starting to transfer the material in, but that will really affect the choices we make on whether to keep parts of the current process and whether they're suitable for the target scales and volumes you're trying to make for your clinical plan. And so it's important to discuss volumes upfront. Some people wonder why we're asking the questions early is to save time. We don't want to pick something that's going to have implications that aren't suited to that project's goals. So a lot of this equipment we use is pretty specialized. It might be something that's used in bioprocessing, for example, but in a different way. A lot of equipment that we use here, we might not be using it in the way the manufacturer intended, or we might be using completely differently than they're used in other areas of pharma or biotech. TFF is a good example of this. We've spent decades optimizing and learning exactly how to run different particle types on TFF so that we can scale the purification of particles to larger volumes that maybe aren't as feasible on a centrifuge. So that's an example where we've developed a very unique scale-up process to nanomaterials that can allow us to make hundreds of liters, where the original synthesis might have been a few mils. So for scale-up, there's a misconception that it's simply a matter of making everything bigger, increasing the masses, increasing the volumes, or doing more efforts in parallel. Nanomaterial doesn't always scale linearly. It can be a little more nuanced than maybe a small molecule or protein, for example. You might want to find a CMC team internally or externally that has previous experience in scaling up nanomaterials, and that's part of what we offer here. Sometimes people will say that this is a good enough scale for now, we can just skip this stage, but there can be advantages to moving to a larger scale. It's not always beneficial to go incrementally. Sometimes it really depends on the type of particle and the process. We might be able to make larger volumes than you need right now, but it's actually an easier and faster process than the one you're using right now. A good example of this is probe sonication. There are plenty of polymeric nanomaterial processes we come across where the customer has a few mils of solution that they're doing probe sonication on, and they want to just scale this exactly and use a larger probe sonicator. That is an option at certain scales, but if your target scales are a different volume, then it may be better to switch to some of the other equipment we have internally, but it really depends on your end goals, the amount of materials you need for your clinical plans, and whether that's the right fit overall. So we do a lot of redevelopment at the point where we're scaling up, and that's why process development and scale up really have to happen hand in hand. So what specifically makes nanomaterials complicated? To get into the particulars, there's a few examples. Metallic nanoparticles, for example, are grown colloidally, and their nucleation and growth are extremely dependent on stir speed, stir method, temperature profile, reagent addition, speed, even glassware shape, and a lot of other considerations. So there may be 20 different levers you could consider pulling in order to change this process, but we know which ones are worth your time and which ones are better to keep consistent when trying to optimize your particles. Because we spend a lot of time on these specific nanomaterials, we've already accounted for a lot of the common issues that arise. This means we can do informed experimental design and rapid troubleshooting, and we've built up a database of SOPs and internal knowledge about exactly what parameters affect these common syntheses. So we know which levers to pull. So lastly, something you can never do too early is to consider terminal sterilization methods. Presumably for therapeutic, you need it to be sterile, and so unless the fabrication or processing of the material is performed under aseptic conditions, you will need a terminal sterilization method. We don't do aseptic processing here. We will work with other companies in San Diego to outsource that, but doing aseptic process development does exponentially add to the cost of the project. So where we can, we find ways to terminally sterilize particles. These can include going through a 0.22 micron sterile filter, doing autoclaving, E-beam irradiation, or even gamma, and we will evaluate the particles at the end of these processes. We'll maybe pick one that we know works for that specific particle type pretty well, and then determine whether or not the particle is stable after that terminal step, and then we can work together to determine the best fit for your project. So as with broader pharmaceutical development, the best approach is to follow quality by design early on. This is a phase-based approach that's important here because we could spend forever developing the perfect process, but the goal is to get something working in patients and making a difference for people. So we have to work to balance timelines, cost, and quality to be able to make the best decisions within your timeline and budget, and keep in mind, above all, the safety of the patients. So quality by design is a strategic approach that ensures consistent manufacture of high-quality products. It involves systematic and proactive processes of integrating different quality considerations for each phase, from R&D to final manufacture. The goal is to assure safety, efficacy, and quality. We already discussed CQAs, which are the measurable characteristics to determine particle performance, and the critical process parameters, which are the variables that affect the manufacturing process, and fine attention to both of these as part of quality by design. Our technical teams working on transfer or process development projects always proceed with the end goal in mind, whether it be a drug product or a device or a component. This quality by design frame of mind helps us manage and assess risks as early as possible and make sure we're making the right decisions or presenting the right decisions to you to make. This isn't something we do independently. It's an ongoing conversation with the product sponsor from start to finish. Both sides have to be contributing and collaborating to make sure that we bring all the points of view together and make the best decisions for your product. So if we complete process development in the right way, once we get to manufacturing, it is just a matter of execution. We have a really important overlap at Nanocomposites between our R&D, our process development, and our MSAT teams. We aren't in different buildings or silos. We really work together. The offices are interspersed. We're all working together on the same projects. And that makes this phase of work involving the same teams who did the initial development of the material and who are helping look at the manufacturing of this product, even helping make it at this stage. So this overlap in personnel helps us avoid having to do internal transfers, and we can avoid a lot of pitfalls that come with that. The collaborative approach saves time and comes with this unique combo of facilities and experience in this space. So another thing to highlight about our manufacturing is that we don't have boxes that your processes have to fit in. We consider every portion of this custom, start to finish, and that allows us to optimize the process for your specific product needs. We aren't trying to fit you in equipment boxes or certain levels of control boxes. We are selecting what is suited to your product and no more or less. Our clean rooms are modular. The equipment and even the classification of the room can change depending on which project is being executed in it, and our teams work together to make that happen. The members of our MSAT team are very experienced and take a collaborative approach with our customers as well. We strive for timely communication, transparency throughout the whole process, and attention to detail at every scale. So being able to scale up and manufacture nanoparticles is one thing, but as you know, actually bringing a product to clinic is another. Each step of this journey has to be well documented by people who know what they're doing, and we have to have the right quality management system in place with rigorous quality control measures to ensure product quality, purity, and stability. So in addition, the quality management system at Nanocomposites is ISO 13485 certified. We are FDA registered and registered in the state of California with medical device and drug manufacturing licenses. So about our facilities and equipment, this is an actual real-life example of one of our clean rooms, not a stock photo. You can see how it's set up. And then these are modular, as I mentioned, so we can tailor the equipment and the space specifically to your manufacturing process. We have 15,000 square feet of R&D and production labs, and we also have BSL-2 rooms and a low humidity dry room. Our processes and procedures are in compliance with the various guidelines, and we are routinely audited for our ISO certification. We also have a walk-in chemical fume hood in one of our clean rooms. So for nanoparticle syntheses that require solvents, we have experience in handling these at fairly large scales safely. So the most important part of our experience is the people. We have scientists on site with decades of experience in nanoparticle development and manufacturing. We have scientists, engineers, manufacturing experts, quality personnel, supply chain specialists, facilities experts, and many others who come together to make a really good team to serve our customers. Collaboration across the many disciplines is important in how we make the best decisions for your projects, and we have a lot of experience in nanoparticle manufacture. So now we get to case studies where I get to tell you a little bit about example projects that we've done in the past. So we've completed hundreds of custom projects successfully for government organizations, academic institutions, and commercial companies across the diagnostic and pharmaceutical space. So a wide variety of industries here. We provide highly confidential services to companies where both the technology and intellectual property are important and to the value of the project. And so we take IP very seriously, we take confidentiality very seriously, and the examples we're bringing you here today, I have permission to share with you. So I go through each of these in detail over the next few slides. So for this project, we made highly concentrated silver nanoplates that are coated in a layer of silica, and the application for these is photothermal acne treatment using standard dermatology lasers. So these plates are about 40 to 50 nanometers. You can see one in the right corner here. They are solid silver coated in a layer of silica, and when you excite them with a laser, they will heat up. So we started with the original design, and we optimized these at very tiny scales. We were able to work with the client to maximize this formulation stability on skin, to increase the treatment efficacy, and then we worked to transfer this material to larger scale and eventually to GMP manufacturing so that we could generate particles suitable for use in their commercial application. So for this next project, we actually made mesoporous silica nanoparticles that the customer utilized in a cell-based cancer therapeutic. So the particles you see are about 100 nanometers, and they have very small single nanometer pores throughout. We did very early feasibility tests with the customer to try different syntheses and optimize for the specifications that would work best in this application. We scaled up the efforts from the small milligram scale again to 50-gram batches for this particular project. And then we did further scale up efforts and began to implement design controls for this product. Then we transferred production under our quality management system to GMP manufacture these particles, and we're actually currently making batches of the material for this customer. In case study 3, we made polymeric nanomaterials for an immunotherapy application. These are PLGA spheres. We started at the R&D phase with this customer to formulate based off of their idea to encapsulate a specific moiety that gave that efficacy. And we developed this immunotherapy product alongside them. We optimized towards defined specifications that we were targeting, and we worked on scaling up these efforts from the mix scale to multi-gram batches of material. We are currently moving production under our quality system for manufacture, and we're in the later stages of process development with this customer. So case study 4 is a cool particle type that has a solid silica core, and it's shelled in a thin layer of gold. This original synthesis was being manufactured elsewhere, and we brought it in and transferred to our manufacturing team to be a second supplier when they needed a second supplier for GMP manufacture. They actually switched to us as the primary supplier. We were able to replicate the protocols, the tests, and the release procedures. We did some GMP production, and now we're the leading supplier for their manufacture of these silica core gold shell nanoparticles. That brings me to the end of the webinar, and thank you for your attention.